So everyone, take two. Thank you so much for your patience. It appears the gremlins in the system have taken the notion of digital disruption to heart. But I am pleased to welcome you wherever in the world you may be to this Flinders University Brave lecture on the theme of Beyond COVID-19, the future of the workplace. We acknowledge we're hosting this forum on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and that we respect and acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. Our Brave lecture series is an opportunity to deep dive into the courageous thinking and brave research that is finding solutions to the challenges of our times. And right now, the challenge of COVID-19 is requiring new thinking about how we do things that we often take for granted, like work. Today, we bring together two thinkers of renown, futurist Andrew Grill and the Director of the Australian Industrial Transformation Institute, Professor John Spoehr. They're going to explore this new pandemic-driven work paradigm and what the workscape of the future might look like. Can we recover? How? And what's the key to our financial security? We're keen for this to be an interactive event, digital disruption willing. So we'll begin with a short presentation from our keynote speaker and then take questions from both of our thinkers. So we're ready to start receiving those questions now, and let's hope it holds firm. You can submit them via the Facebook Live event on the Flinders University website, or you could also join the conversation through Twitter using the hashtag #BraveResearch. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Andrew Grill. He's a former IBM Global Managing Partner who's highly sought for his analysis of issues affecting employment, from digital disruption and emerging technologies right through to the workplace of the future. Andrew is Adelaide born and bred and joins us tonight from London. So Andrew, welcome.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks everyone for persevering. Digital disruption is something I talk about a lot, and we're actually experiencing it right now, but I'm sure it's not the first time that a Zoom call or a Google Hangout hasn't worked. You'll see on my slide, I call myself a practical futurist, and today I'm going to give you some practical advice. It comes from working for large companies like IBM, as Karen said, Telstra and Optus, as well as 12 years running 6 different startups, both in Australia and the UK. So I know what it's like to work for large and small organisations, also work from home and also the office. The one question I get asked the most about, even before COVID-19, was what is the future of work? And it's such a broad question. But I think about when we think about the world of what is the future of work, we need to think about the 3 Ps. That is people, place and purpose. And I'll focus on the last 2, place and purpose, for the next few minutes. Place has now become really important. Where do we work? And for the last couple of months, for most of us, it's been at home. But when we go back to the office, will we want to go back and work in the office or in some third place? And I'll talk about that in a moment. The last P, purpose. I'm sure a lot of you are really happy that you're not commuting on that smelly bus or train for a couple of hours into work every day, and you've got a lot of your productive time back. So what is the purpose? Why am I working for this organisation? Why am I doing the way I'm doing it? So I think when we think about the future of work, we need to think about not just the people involved, but the place and also the purpose. Now, I talk about disruption a lot. And before COVID, I was talking about disruption in terms of digital disruption, how technology is impacting organisations around the world of all sizes and how they're adapting to it. And what I would normally do when I talk about disruption is I would say some of this is going to happen in 3 to 5 years. The last 2 months has shown us that some of these predictions are actually happening in the next 3 to 5 weeks. There's a good example here in London. A large bank had 50,000 people working in the office at a desk. Almost overnight, those 50,000 people were working from home. Now, I'm sure in the old world, the working from home process or policy would have been tried and tested. There would have been pilot programs. There would have been a committee. No, we just have to do this. So I would like to think about disruption as being a huge opportunity for change. We cannot go back to the way we've always done it. We need to learn from this terrible period when we've all been disrupted, and what can we learn from it, and what can we do differently to make our lives and our jobs better. Because like it or not, we've been in the world's largest work from home experiment. I've never experienced a time in my life where every city, every country in the world has the same governmental restrictions. Like most of you, I've been working from home. I've had limited ability to go out. Most of our shops here in London are still closed. And so when you work from home, you've had to do things very, very differently. A good friend of mine, a married couple, her husband is basically working for a bank. And so he's taken over the kitchen table with 2 large screens. And so while he's doing that, there's no way that their life can return to normal. So we've learned a lot about what it means to work from home. But we're now talking in Australia and in the UK about a return to the office. And so we need to work out, are we going to work from home or are we going to work from the office? Or is there a middle place, what I call the third place? Howard Schultz from Starbucks famously coined this phrase. He wanted people to use Starbucks as that third place where they got work done. So I think one of the things that we need to consider, and John and I might talk about it a bit later on, is there a middle ground between working from home and working from the office? And so when we work away from the office, do we do it in some third place? Is it a co-working space within a university? Is it a Servcorp or a WeWork where we actually rent some time and work in a safe place where we can get work done? Or is it a large department store that doesn't need the space, as much space as they needed before? And so they've actually set up these third places where you can come and get your work done that isn't at home, but also isn't at work. The other thing we've learned a lot about over the last couple of months is collaboration. And when I was at IBM, I ran a consulting team that looked at how we collaborate at work using the tools that many of you may have been using before the epidemic or may have been forced to use to get work done. So think about how you've actually interacted with colleagues and clients and suppliers. How could you move that forward? Because I'm not a medical expert, but I don't think we're going to be having the same way and the same place of work for some time. So use this disruptive time as an opportunity to see how you can be more collaborative going forward, knowing that you may not always be able to have that stolen coffee moment with someone down the corridor. The other thing we talk a lot about is being agile. An agile methodology for software development has been around for a while, and a lot of companies are now adopting this methodology to make quick decisions. That bank I spoke about earlier that went from 50,000 at desks to 50,000 at home had to make an agile decision. They couldn't run a pilot. They couldn't look at all the pros and cons. Another company I'm actually speaking to this afternoon about this very topic overnight decided to go to an online document signing platform called DocuSign. They said, we just need to get work done. We can't have a trial period. We just need to implement it. So people are going to have to work in a more agile way, and let's use that experience to actually get work done in a more effective way. I want to spend a moment or two talking about the gig economy. You may all think the gig economy is just about delivery drivers and taxi drivers. No, you could be a gig worker. In fact, I'm a gig worker. I'm an executive gig worker. I have multiple clients. Every day is different, and I can actually spend my time and my energy working for different clients. Back to those 3 Ps. You may find you actually want to have a different purpose and use your skills and experience for multiple clients, not just one company where you go for 5 days a week and sit at a desk. So we'll talk a moment about the gig economy as well. Final point I want to make is using technology to ensure we have a safe return to work. I know in Australia and certainly here in the UK, we're now looking to say we're past the worst of this. How do we get people back to work in a very safe way? Now, if you're an HR professional or director of HR, you have a duty of care to make sure that people are going to go back to work safely. The government in Australia and also in the UK have developed COVID-safe apps that allow you to have contact tracing. And they work really well for governments and for healthcare professionals. But if you have a duty of care and someone was diagnosed with COVID, do you close down the whole floor or the whole building? The notion of using IoT or Internet of Things, sensors in buildings to be able to basically sense air quality, movement, those sorts of things. And I'm actually working with a company here in London called Microshare that have augmented their asset tracking solution that would normally be tracking in hospitals things like defibrillators and beds. You actually put a very small Bluetooth beacon on the back of your ID badge, and it actually will allow you to do contact tracing that your organisation can then help ensure that you have a safe return to work. So we're going to see technology play a big part in ensuring that we have a safer place to work going forward. And we may have more information about the way our spaces are used. So let me give you some tips about what you can be doing this week, next week, and what you can be thinking about your return to work and how the future of work might look like. Whenever I'm on stage, one of the tips I give people is to run a hackathon. A hackathon might be a 24-hour experience where you get senior leaders and young leaders together to solve business problems. You get beer, Wi-Fi, and pizza and a large room. That's not possible for the indeterminate future, so why not do a virtual hackathon? Why not block out a Friday afternoon, get everyone on a Zoom call or a Google Hangout and look at some really deep business problems and have everyone contribute to that? That might be something tangible that you can do in terms of a virtual hackathon. I want you also to be digitally curious. Some of the terminology I used this morning may be foreign to you. You may be saying, what does that mean? I encourage everyone that I speak to learn what these technologies can do, what they can't do, and what they mean for you personally and also for your business. Technology will play a key part in the future of work, and you need to be up to speed. You may need to reskill about some of these technologies. And finally, you need to rethink why, where, and when you go to work. Back to the purpose. Why do you do the job you do for that particular company? Where do you do it? Do you need to do it at home, at the office, or in that third place? And when do you do it? The gig worker has a very flexible way of working, and maybe that's something you should look at as well. So many things that we've talked about here. I also have a podcast series, and the very latest podcast on my podcast series talks to a gentleman called Dan Ziv, who runs a company called TouchNote. He has a team of 50 people, and he gave a really interesting account, both as a manager, what it's like to work from home, and how he now empathizes with people that ask to work from home. So a lot to unpack there on the webinar today. I'd like to throw back to Karen, and let's see how we can address some of those topics I've covered.
Thanks, Andrew. It's really clear that the challenges are significant, but so are the opportunities. I'd like to introduce Professor John Spoehr to the conversation now. He's the Director of the Flinders University's Australian Industrial Transformation Institute, and he's also Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Research Impact here. He's an authority on employment, economic development and the evolution of work. So to get us started, I'd like you both to consider for a moment, what is it that we need to look at if we're going to seize, I think, what we would call enduring opportunities from this crisis? There's a lot of focus on the here and now. What do we need to do to make things work for us in the moment? But what do we need to consider going forward if we want to make this part of our lasting landscape? So is it the digital readiness? Is it personal skills development? Is it a job for governments to be adapting their policies? So where do you see the principal challenge lies?
Just picking up on one of Andrew's key points, I think this digital experiment, if you like, has resulted in many of us increasing our digital literacy, if you like. So we've learnt more in a shorter period of time about how to manage a digital life remotely in our homes. And that's a very positive legacy that we can take away from this experience and I think build it into our working lives, whether or not we're in the workplace or whether or not we're working at home or whether or not we're in an intermediary organisation like Andrew was suggesting. But I'm very mindful that I and Andrew and others are the lucky ones. We were able to work from home and there are many millions of people, of course, around the world that are not working. So in the US alone, probably in excess of 32 million. Around 1 million people in Australia lost their jobs in a very short period of time. So we've got a massive challenge getting those people back into work, putting them in a position where they're able to utilise their digital skills and take advantage of the opportunities ahead of us. So it's important that we focus on both sides of those equations. That is a rapid transition back to work for the many millions that are out of work, and of course, building on this digital experiment, I think.
Andrew, have you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So John is right. We are very lucky, and most of my friends, again, are working from home in well-paid jobs. And when I walk down the high street here in London, and every single shop, other than the 1 in 20, are closed, I think about the 20 or 30 people that would have been working there that now aren't. So when we are able to go back to work, I mean, my local pub around the corner, I can't wait to share a drink with my friends. How can we help those people in that sort of hybrid environment where we know that we're not going to have a very full indoor experience for a while? So can we use back to technology to help people actually book ahead? And I think where before, venues like pubs and clubs might have been toying with these apps, let's build a relationship with people who actually want to come and use our facilities. Look to the companies that have been able to leverage a kitchen and a delivery app to basically keep trading. So that last mile, we're using technology to order our food. Can we use that last mile to have a better relationship and experience with our local store? I think companies, good example here, Primark, a well-known example, a fairly low-end fashion store. They sell beautiful clothes at very low prices. They had an £800 million revenue per week before the pandemic, but no e-commerce strategy, so their revenue went down to zero. So I'm hoping that someone in the last 2 months has been thinking about how they have an e-commerce strategy. So you shouldn't be like that. You should use this opportunity to say there's an opportunity for a hybrid experience for people coming into the store and people who want to keep transacting online. Are we ready for that? And that may mean, to John's point, reskilling. It may mean we don't need as many people in store, but we need people fulfilling and doing customer care, and we can cross and retrain them.
So are we going to face a bit of a chasm in the short term where, there are going to be some companies that simply haven't kept pace and there's going to be a bit of a legacy as a result of that ill-preparedness? Is there something that we can be doing now to help fill in that chasm and get people back to where they need to be?
Well, I think just as this has accelerated our own digital literacy, the growth in our digital literacy, it's going to accelerate some change in our workplaces and in businesses around the world. So, and Andrew's right, I think the uptake and diffusion of advanced technologies, digital technologies, will accelerate. It will increase. It's been very rapid over the last decade, but we will see it accelerate. And those people who are exposed to that, who understand the great strength, the great advantages of being digitally savvy, will be the ones that will be able to enjoy and take advantage of the opportunities going ahead. So from in terms of situating yourself in the labour market, taking advantage of those opportunities, a digital education is fundamental to our security as individuals. But of course, we've got to bring everyone along with us on that journey. This problem of the digital divide still haunts us in 2020. So there are many people who haven't been able to take advantage of the digital revolution, and we must bring them along with us. Otherwise, we will have, as you're suggesting, a sort of cavern between the digital insiders and the digital outsiders. So there's a lot of work to do in that respect, and universities and vocational education and training institutions have a critical role to play in helping to bridge that gap for those people who are on the outside of the digital revolution.
Andrew?
Well, government has a role to play here, and I think, like I said, everyone has been impacted the same way. Just as managers have had to work at home, and Dan on my podcast talks about the fact that he really wasn't as sympathetic to people who wanted to work from home before the pandemic, but having to homeschool his 7-year-old and being at home all the time, and he then understands what it's like and the challenges that these people face. Whenever I would speak to people that make public policy, I would implore them to think like disruptors. So when they're making public policy, it needs to keep up with the technological advances. In the UK here, we've actually had Parliament sitting remotely where the bulk of the parliamentarians were on a Zoom call back into the chamber. And so I bet for the first time, some of those 600-odd politicians here were getting used to using video conferencing that they'd never done before. And so the policymakers, that's not just the politicians, but their advisors, have now seen how technology can actually get work done. Most of my friends have reported an uptick in productivity because they're not doing the minutiae that they might do in the office. Not suggesting for a moment we all have to work from home or in the third place. But again, back to my point, this disruptive time, what can we learn? What has worked better and where have been the impediments? The bank that moved from 50,000 people in the office to work from home, which would have taken months before to get approved, it shouldn't take a pandemic to approve this. Just thinking now while we're talking, we've had the Industrial Revolution, we've had the Internet Revolution, maybe we've had the COVID Revolution where an external force has forced us to think differently. And maybe, just maybe, this will go down in the annals as a revolution where we actually changed the way we got work done.
Have we got the capacity to actually turn this into a durable revolution, though? One of the great challenges has been just not having the connectivity. The NBN has not, kept us online for those working hours. There have been backlogs and the pipeline's just not coping. I mean, is there a call here for governments in particular, but companies also, to rethink their investment in technology and how they're going to equip people to be able to be smarter, to work harder and faster?
Well, certainly here in Australia, the crisis has pushed the NBN to the very limit of its capability, and I'm sure that's the case all over the world, in the UK as well. So there are some takeaway lessons from that in terms of how we might strengthen the networks here in Australia and internationally, and fibre to the home was always the hope of many of us, and I'm sure we'll revisit that decision to see what we can do to ensure that people are not subject to the sort of bottlenecks that we've experienced here. But if we're going to enable people to be able to work productively from home, we're going to have to ensure that we've got the pipelines going into their homes that enable things that we can't quite imagine now, that will take place in years to come, that will require a lot more bandwidth than we're currently using. And that's been difficult for policymakers to imagine, and for us to imagine as well. We're using a lot more bandwidth, so we need those pipes to be much more substantial. I'm sure Andrew's got some interesting experience on that.
Yeah, the whole notion of digital curiosity, I'm sure, again, many people that are in a senior role that have high-speed broadband or high-speed internet to their office haven't experienced what we all have experienced before, because they don't have that need. So I think, again, when you've got the managers and the policymakers getting frustrated because they can't connect their Zoom call or can't get on Skype, or the things are slow, they will then say, okay, something has to be done. And what I've seen around the world, the governments have had an immediate effect in protecting jobs. Both in Australia and the UK, there have been a number of initiatives to pay workers their salary. Let's get them back into work. But I think then we need to have a look at what is the infrastructure we need to support this going forward, not just the technological infrastructure and broadband and internet and those sort of things, but the policy to allow these things, to allow remote signing, to allow document storage, to distribute this. I think what we're going to see is, we call it the high street here in the UK, the main strip of a big road where all the shops are. Will we see that actually have a very augmented phase where you don't have as many banks anymore because people are going online? So what do we do with those spaces? So I think we're going to see a lot of change, but I'm glad that everyone has experienced it, because if you try to explain to a senior manager why you need faster broadband at home, they may not approve that request. Now they're going to approve the request because they've had that frustration. So again, in a way, this disruption has allowed all the people in positions of authority to see exactly how we need to improve.
That's a good point. John, were you going to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, more broadly, I think that the challenge for all nations at the moment, and Australia is probably grappling with this more rapidly than other nations, is flattening to curves. We've heard that terminology used a lot, haven't we? So we have to flatten the curve of exponential rise in the virus and in infections internationally, but we've also got to flatten the curve of exponentially rising unemployment. So those two things have to happen in parallel, but we've got to approach flattening the exponential rise in unemployment in the same aggressive, robust way that we've done with the virus here in Australia. So that means very patient, substantial investment by government to bring everyone along with us over the next couple of years. There's no easy way out of this. It's going to take 18 months to 2 years to really get anywhere near the employment levels that we had prior to the crisis back in Australia, and that's true in the UK and other parts of the world right at the moment. So you've got to think about this as, recovery from recession once you've recovered from the coronavirus. And fortunately, we're ahead of other nations in tackling that right at the moment, but I don't think anyone quite understands how substantial the investment required to really make a difference in the short term.
We actually have a viewer question from Tanya. She's seeking to know the panel's view on workers being able to work from home, particularly if they're sick, for example, or have other responsibilities. So the previous mindset might have been that if you were suffering from a bit of a sniffle, for example, you might soldier on so as not to use your sick pay. Now you need to be supported to work from home to potentially limit the spread of viruses. So essentially a question about the attitude of employers to the traditional ways of working. Do we need to see a shift in what the employer is willing to tolerate from their workforce in order to support ongoing work in this fashion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the notion that we should soldier on is a problem, particularly here in Australia. I think that cultural attitude that we should soldier on through winter with colds and sniffles, and of course we've been very successful spreaders of colds and flus historically. But what we've learnt from this crisis, and I think this is an important lesson, is that if we apply the sort of hygiene standards that we have applied during the coronavirus crisis, we can actually significantly reduce absenteeism, sickness, illness in the workplace. And that's evidenced by the sharp decline in the number of flu cases in Australia, as is, I think, probably the experience in other parts of the world at the moment. So we should not be encouraging people to soldier on. We should be encouraging them to stay home. And now we know that they can work productively from home. There should be a much higher level of trust by us in our workforce.
Andrew, some thoughts?
The trust thing is just so important, and I think we've had to trust our workers here. They'll get work done because there'd be no option. But I really think the HR director that denies a work from home request because you've got a sniffle, everyone's going to say, really? I just don't think that will happen. I think there will be a tectonic shift in the empathy from people. Back to my point that every single person that has to approve that request has worked at home and knows that you can get work done. So I think the whole, like I said, this is a big experiment. It would have taken months to have people approve this and pilots and everything else. Anyone, you just go, don't you remember a few months ago?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've actually got another question which is analogous to that. It's a question about access to technology and those of advantage versus those who are disadvantaged. And thank you, Natsokai, who has sent this question in. He's saying, as we're trying to take everyone with us, we also need to ensure that all of these platforms are accessible to all. So it's not just the basic technology, but also the capacity that comes with that technology. How big a challenge is that, here in Australia, let alone in emerging economies?
Well, I really see access to high-speed internet as a public good. It's necessary as a foundation for a modern society in the digital age. So governments and we as taxpayers should see it as an investment that everyone has access to high-speed internet, broadband internet. So we've got a long way to go to ensure that households right throughout the nation and throughout other countries have access to high-speed internet. So, and the costing structure doesn't support that at the moment. So the households are, mostly on the lower register of subscribing to NBN accounts. So I think that we need to think about how we can ensure that there is universal access to NBN to ensure a basic standard of NBN that's going to suit the needs of a digital society.
So how do we do that? Is it subsidisation? Is it offering infrastructure to those who otherwise can't afford it? And how do you then test that? I mean, is Andrew, is that something you've encountered? John, I mean, is this something that's doing the rounds in terms of thinking?
Andrew.
Yeah, the whole issue of broadband for all, it's a tricky one because it's not a free resource. And even though I've lived in the UK for 14 years, I've followed the NBN's process very carefully and used it as a case study of what not to do in some of the decisions that have been taken. I don't think that's that controversial. I think we also need to look at alternative technologies like 5G. So ironically, a lot of people I know in Australia have actually got a 5G device that they run their business off because the NBN sort of maxes out. And I think the sort of technology as we evolve from 5G and other standards will actually allow more capacity over the air interface than actually through copper or fibre, but ultimately, obviously, we want fibre to the home. But that is not going to be something that we can probably do very, very easily. So are there alternate technologies? And just as the government, to John's point, has subsidised these people that are now furloughed or unemployed, does the government need to subsidise broadband as a universal right? Do employers? I mean, the question that some of my friends have asked, if you're working at home all the time, who pays for the broadband, electricity? Is that something that employers need to look at in terms of a home package, not just the kit that you've got, but to connect the kit? Is that something that the government or the employer would sponsor?
Yeah, perhaps that goes to the idea of a digital New Deal. We've talked a bit about that over recent weeks as we've been preparing for today. And I think that's something that we should seriously consider across nations, and that is, what's a fundamental base package of access to digital technologies, not just the NBN, but also the equipment and the software that's necessary these days to communicate in the way in which we have. Despite the difficulties we've had today, this is fundamental to our communications going forward across nations, between households and throughout communities.
We've received a question from Alison which actually looks at the other side of working from home and is seeking to understand what role employers might have and responsibilities in relation to health and well-being of workers, with social isolation a particular factor, and whether there are mental health risks when people aren't in a communal environment. Your thoughts on that? Is that something we need to factor into any dispersed working structure?
Yeah, I think social support is one of the big questions that we need to ask ourselves going forward about this experiment. We need to talk to each other about what we've learnt from this experience, listen to different workers in different parts of the country and in different circumstances with different family pressures as well. So it is important that we take away the lessons that we can learn from this. As Andrew suggested, this is an extraordinary period in our history, an experiment that we would never, of course, have undertaken by choice, but we've had it imposed on us. So at least we can step back and ask questions of each other about what we've learnt from it, and then apply that both in our workplaces but also in our households, and look at what the responsibilities are of employers to us when we are socially isolated. And we can't assume that this is going to be the last pandemic that we'll experience. We've got to assume that this might be the first. And so if that's the case, then we need to be better prepared for the next one.
So I've got a question for Andrew which sort of flows from that. There's a query here from Karen saying, look, productivity might have increased, but the cross-pollination opportunities have decreased. So you don't have your teams overhearing each other, chance conversations in the corridor, etc. And you're a gig worker, you understand what it's like to be flying solo, as it were, but still connected. So how do we reach a point where we still have that the rapport that you need to actually get the job done when you don't have the tea room conversation and the corridor chats?
It's a really good point, and that's the one thing you're going to miss, but that can be replicated in one way digitally. There's a great book by a man called John Spoehr called Working Out Loud. You can buy it on Amazon, and he talks about the notion of when you use these collaboration tools, when you can't have that stolen coffee moment, you actually tell the rest of the organisation what you're working on. And I did an experiment when I was at IBM running this consulting practice around collaboration. Our team overtly shared everything we did. And then we found that because IBM was 400,000 strong, when people were hearing what we were doing, they were saying, oh, I can help you there. So while for a period we may not have those coffee meetings, and this is hard, and when I talk to people about this, it's very hard for some generations to sort of share what they're doing, because remember, what I hold close to me, information is power. But I think in the future, an organisation's value is not what you know, it's what you share. And so to the questioner, I would suggest if you've got some collaboration tools, can you share what you're doing? Obviously, if it's confidential, you can't. But the more you share, the more other people can go, I can help you there. So that may be a way that we can digitally collaborate. And while we can't physically have those conversations, other people know what we're working on and how they can help us.
There's another question here which is probably suited to John, but you might both like to have a crack at it. And it's actually looking at higher education. So I suppose it's no surprise, given that we're hosting this as a higher education institution. But looking at the what needs to happen to resolve the challenge that's facing students of today. So many were enrolled in degrees and were supporting themselves with employment. That employment has now vanished. They may need to exit their degrees in order to find other supports to keep themselves going, and as a result, the staff members that would have been required to teach those students won't be in demand. So you've got a loss of casual workers potentially at higher education levels. Are we facing a generation of of people who have been denied access to education as a result of this this particular pandemic? Is this going to be a rock in the pond where the ripples keep flowing out? And what do we need to do to support people to ensure that they can get the education they need in order to thrive?
Well, young people have been hit very, very hard by the COVID-19 crisis, and not just here in Australia, but worldwide. And what we know from past downturns, economic downturns, recessions, is that it represents a major shakeout of the youth labour market, and usually come out of that with fewer full-time jobs. But what we also know from this particular crisis that the industries that have been most affected are those industries that young people have been working in. All those casual jobs in hospitality, tourism and so on, they just haven't been available over the last few months. And there'll be ongoing impacts, of course, too, for many people as international tourism is not possible for the foreseeable future. So we have to expect that young people will be doing it hard for a long time to come. So the income support regime that's necessary to ensure that young people are able to continue to participate in higher education, it's fundamental that they be enabled to do so, must be put in place. So here in Australia, as in the UK, there have been a couple of schemes. The JobKeeper scheme here in Australia has been incredibly valuable. It's provided a life raft to millions of people, over 6 million people here in Australia. And of course, the increase in the job seeker allowance has been incredibly valuable too here in Australia. It was doubled, from $550 to $1,100. So we need to recognise that these are exceptional circumstances requiring additional income support, probably for the next year or so while we work our way through this crisis.
It leads us to a question perfectly timed from Joe. How might an organisation make a graceful transition from office-based work, maybe closing offices altogether, to a more flexible, decentralised work environment? So has it been done well? And if so, who did it well? Where did they do it well? Who are the thought leaders in this space? Andrew, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so look to the tech companies that have been doing this for a while. So Twitter came out as an organisation saying, we will let you work from home if you want to work from home, period. No limit, no end date. If you want to work from home and you can work from home, you can work from home. And I think they're leading the way. And Facebook's done a similar thing. I think till the end of 2020, they'll allow people to work from home if they need to. I think this will become the norm, that it won't be forcing you to come into the office. To the question before, there'll be some social interaction you want by coming into an office or a third place. But we'll need to allow people to be able to do that. So look at what the tech companies are doing. I think not because they are exemplars, but they've been doing this for a while. Many teams are distributed. Many people listening right now probably work from home anyway and are able to adapt to that. But look at what they're doing. Look at also how you employ people. Would you want to work for a company that had that policy? Famously, Netflix has a policy about vacation, which is take vacation. And I think we're going to start to see more companies like that basically say, we trust you, do what you need to do, be productive, and we'll respect you.
I think there are a couple of other reasons that we might think that this is a very important trend to continue to support. And one of them is really around the environment. And of course, one of the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis is more people staying at home, less traffic on the roads, less pollution, lower CO2 emissions, and in a greenhouse gas emission world in which we want to bring CO2 emissions down, there are strong public policy arguments for why we might want to encourage people to work from home. But of course, those of us who've been on the road during the crisis would also welcome the fact that the roads have been less congested. So if we think about this holistically, actually there are lots of advantages from encouraging people to work from home over the next 5 to 10 years to tackle a range of problems, but also to trust our workforce that they will be productive. And we know from this experience that the vast bulk of people have been very productive working from home. So managers have got to give up a bit of control, a bit of authority, and not see presenteeism as a virtue.
So we've got a question from Stephanie who's asking you both to polish your crystal balls. What will we be doing better in the workplace as a result of the COVID changes and experimentation? So what do you think we might, we're doing lots of things well, but what might we continue to do things better? What might we be doing better as a result of this?
Andrew? Go for it, Andrew.
I hope we'll have less meetings. Because I think you realise that when you sit down and have a meeting about a meeting, it was funny, I saw on Twitter someone said they now realise what their husband does. He goes to meetings, he attends meetings, and he has meetings about meetings. I think that's got to change. Back to my point about being agile. The agile methodology, you actually have a stand-up scrum where you stand around for 15 minutes and talk about what you've been working on, what you need help with, and what you're doing next, and then you get on with it. So I think we're probably going to see less formality. We've also proven that you can get things done when you're not always present as well. The present team things, I think, will go away. But it comes back to that collaboration point and working out loud. If people know what you're doing, they don't need to ask you for a report on what you're doing. So I think that might be one of the blessings out of this.
I'll go for a bigger picture issue, and that is that during this crisis, we've I think rediscovered how important it is to have effective governments in place. And those nations that have had effective governments in place have managed the crisis well, and those that have struggled with their governance are having sustained chronic problems in managing COVID-19. And on our way out of this, I think that will also prove to be the case. If we're going to recover from the jobs crisis that we're in the middle of, we will need our government to continue to be aggressive, robust in its responses, and to invest in growth, but very much grounded, if you like, in the lessons that we've learnt from the digital revolution that's been taking place over the last couple of months. Lots of good takeaways from it, but we need to embed that in our lives much more than we have.
We've got a question here that's come from Joe. And it relates to, and to Steph actually, so we've got a hybrid question here. So let's bolt them together. Never before have workforces experienced 3/4 generations in one place working together. So how do older generations maintain relevance in the digitally emphasised environments? And the follow-up from Joe is young people are generally digitally literate. So does the future really just belong to them? So could we maybe unpack that one?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and one of the ways that we can do that, of course, is through reverse mentoring. Young people mentoring older workers, and that's proven to be really effective in a lot of workplaces around the world. So we desperately need to transfer knowledge from older workers to younger workers, and we've got, particularly in ageing populations in countries that are ageing rapidly, we're losing a lot of capability that shouldn't be lost to our workplaces by people retiring and not transferring that knowledge and capability onto younger workers. But at the same time, we could keep many older workers, or we could provide a much age-friendly workplace by through reverse mentoring. That is, supporting older workers make the transition to being digitally savvy workers, and that's a challenge for all of us really, because the learning curve is steep for many, and so I think that sort of strategy can help.
It's very Groucho Marx, isn't it? I think he said, a child of 4 could do this. Someone get me a child of 4.
Yeah.
Andrew, do you have some thoughts?
Back to my notion of being digitally curious, I think anyone is able to learn. My parents are now on Zoom because I've got them on there and there was a need for them to use Zoom as well. So once you're over that hump and realise that it's quite easy to use, I think anyone can use it. But it's not a case of, well, I can't do that, but I want people to be leaning forward when digital is mentioned and have that curiosity. So what is blockchain? What is AI? What does it mean for me? You've got time to do some research. So I think the fact you've got all these generations in the house, yes, the older generation may say, well, these youngies, they do it so easily. But to John's point, teach me how to do that so I can be as smart as you are. And I think it's a huge opportunity right now to do a skills transfer within the home. So be digitally curious, and to the younger folk, be digitally patient and explain things sensibly and calmly.
We've got a question here from Carice about how will employers onboard and train new employees when working from home? So you're not able to sit together to do the training, the handover, get them across the systems and processes, etc. Can we digitise that process effectively, do you think?
Well, look, there are tools and platforms for doing that, and they're certainly more sophisticated than they used to be, but I wouldn't like to see them as a replacement for face-to-face interaction in the workplace. And look, it hasn't been possible, has it, during the current crisis for that face-to-face onboarding to occur. And for those of us that have had to onboard people remotely, that's proved to be a big challenge. So we have to remember that the quality of that experience, that is the onboarding experience, hasn't been there over the period of this crisis, and reflect on that and spend the time that's necessary to, over a coffee or in a meeting or face-to-face, that's necessary to really build trust in a workplace.
Andrew, have you got thoughts on that?
I think I talked to lots of different startups who all have a solution to all of these problems, and video interviewing and recruitment isn't new. So I think we need to say, okay, I take John's point. I like the human touch. I like being able to sit down next to someone and explain how things work. But in the meantime, is there a middle ground? I talked before about DocuSign, about executing documents. There are a number of other products that do the same thing. So rather than having to physically cite a document, can we do it electronically? So these companies have been around for years, but no one's ever really known there was a digital way of doing it. So can you explore these things? And to John's point, you need that human interaction, but can it be a hybrid? That part of the onboarding might be digital, part of it might be in person as well. And I would encourage people to explore how these problems can be solved through technology in a hybrid way.
I've received a question here for John. We've got Steph, who's interested in knowing what his research is focused on at the moment, particularly in relation to building capacity of workforces for the future. And also that AI, artificial intelligence, might seem a bit futuristic, like a futuristic ideal. How is that being used in our industries and workforces now? So a bit of a double whammy question. What sort of research are you doing? And a bit of an exploration of AI and its role in the workplace of the future.
Sure, no, big questions. No, thanks for that question. Look, one of the big challenges for all organisations is how we can accelerate the uptake and diffusion of advanced technologies. It really doesn't matter what sector you might be talking about, but it's not just a technological question, and that's one of the areas of our research at the moment, and that is trying to understand the range of human factors that impact the uptake and diffusion of technology, and fear, of course, of the technology, or fear that it might take your job. There are lots of fears that surround it, but there are also lots of practical questions about how technology and humans interact in workplaces. So we must better understand that. And so we're doing work in the shipbuilding industry, for example, at the moment, which has a history of not being a digital leader, but it has an aspiration to be a digital leader, to create what's called the digital shipyard, if you like. And so working alongside the big shipbuilders here in Australia, we've got $90 billion worth of shipbuilding happening in this nation, and it'll be a major driver of jobs growth and capability growth over years to come. So ensuring that workforce is digitally ready is a big part of what we're doing at the moment. So supporting them with training on the one hand to improve your digital literacy and understand the wide range of technologies that are available to us to support manufacturing is very important. But also undertaking research on how you might test and trial these technologies and then apply them in a real-world setting like a shipyard. So it could be any workplace, but we're doing this in a fairly focused way at the moment in the shipbuilding sector for obvious reasons. It's such a big industry here in South Australia at the moment. On AI, well, look, it's everywhere, and it's not as if it's something that's foreign to us, and our phones are a good example. Whatever brand of phone you use, there's AI technology in many of the apps that we might use on a day-to-day basis. So it's not that foreign, out there, remote thing. It's actually a bigger part of our lives than you might imagine. But the power of AI is something that we'll harness more over coming years, and it will be something that will be quite ubiquitous, I think, over years to come. So those people who expose themselves to AI and the power of AI will be very well situated in the workforce of the future. I'm sure Andrew will have something to say about that as well.
Yeah, I get asked all the time about, where does AI fit into the workplace and will it take my job away? And this is not new. The Industrial Revolution displaced jobs and we learned how to be more efficient. So to John's point, I think AI will help. I like to talk about AI rather in terms of artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence, because you may not realize that you have to train these systems. You have to learn from humans. And so you have to have smart humans to train them on what to do. And I think we're going to see the rise of augmented AI, where you don't have to be an AI expert to program these things, but you want to know what are the latest sales figures or what are the trends in this area, and your AI bot will go off and do that. It will even impact us in our personal lives. So Google have a thing at the moment called Google Duplex, where it can actually make a call to a restaurant and have an interaction via voice to book a table for you. I think we are not too far away from the rise of the digital agent that actually runs your life for you. And in that case, I'd be very happy for an agent looking to renew my health insurance and my net account and those sort of things. So I think we'll start to see more and more of it. But again, by embracing this technology and finding out what it can do and what it can't do, I think will be very, very helpful. AI in the workplace will have huge positive impacts, I believe.
So we've got a couple of late questions now. I know we're getting very close to time, but I might just see if we can slip this one in very quickly. If working from home could be the standard and therefore the employee could be anywhere in the world, does it make it easier to source the most incredible candidates for some of these jobs, Barbara asks. So are there advantages to outsourcing, maybe workforce efficiencies that can be had by tapping into a global market? Gentlemen, your thoughts?
Well, the technology, of course, makes it possible to work remotely in any part of the world, in many industries. It's not the case with all sectors, so we can't generalise really. It depends on what sector you're working in. Look, as we speak, people from all over the globe are communicating with each other, contributing to projects here in Australia and the UK. The exchange of knowledge and skills is much more dynamic than you might imagine right now, right at the moment. And this will only rise as the sophistication and the quality of the digital tools that are available to us become more ubiquitous and become more available, and we become better at using them. So, and I'm sure that this digital experiment that we've been through is going to help a lot with that. It is a global market for talent. We see that most pronounced during economic upturns, upswings rather than downturns. At the moment, unfortunately, we've got too many people who are unemployed. But look, generally speaking, we'll see these platforms as fundamentally important going forward to supporting accessing talent around the world for all sorts of projects.
And a quick question also, Andrew. What sort of contingencies might we put in place to use those spaces that previously were offices and now with people working from home, do we have a brand new asset that we could be tapping into or repurposing, for business hubs or what have you? What's your thought in that regard?
Absolutely. This notion of a third place, I think, will come into its own, where it might be that you used to have a whole floor plate you don't need anymore. In fact, I was asked late last year about someone building a building in Canada 7 years in the future and what would they consider. And I didn't talk about technology. I talked about reusable space because I said the notion of the future's work is you don't sit at a desk and do this all the time. You need to have flexibility. So if you're I use the supermarket example, it may be they don't need to use all that space. So they repurpose it as a co-working hub. So I think while we will have a downturn, there'll be lots of space that's empty. Can we have it as a third place so people can come from other organisations? Now, then you've got issues around security and IP and all those sort of things, but we can solve those. So we will still build new buildings, but maybe it won't be just the one company that occupies a space. We share it. And back to the gig worker notion as well, you may have different people that actually have a better experience because they can collaborate with people they may not normally meet.
So final questions, gentlemen, and this is the big one. The real crystal ball question, your forecast for where we're going to find ourselves in the next 6 to 12 months. Andrew, global scale, John, nationally here in Australia. Andrew, first to you, what do you think the global outlook is like?
Well, we won't be back to work in the normal way anytime soon. I think into 2021, we still won't have full offices. We will still won't have a lot of international travel. We'll have worked out, this 2 months has been a snapshot. We will now start sitting down and going, okay, what have we learned? How can we extrapolate that into the 2-year scenario as well? So I think I'll have better defined work from home, work away from home strategies. I think governments also will start to regulate and the policymakers will start to be more digital and remote worker friendly. I think the commercial property sector will have to flex and do different things as well. So I think in 12 months' time, it will look different, but we won't go back. And in fact, I don't want us to go back to the way we were. I want us to change.
John.
So, I mean, we're just the other side of the coronavirus crisis here in Australia, and many other nations are right in the middle of it. So, and the economic crisis that follows that, or has accompanied that, is very substantial. We have to accept that it will take a good number of years to recover from this. So, unemployment in the United States and many parts of Europe and other parts of the world is very, very high right at the moment. It's well in excess of 12 to 14%. Probably in real terms, here in Australia at the moment, it's around 14.5%. So you don't recover quickly from that. You have to invest your way out of it. You've got to put in place measures that help accelerate the growth of industries that are sustainable over the medium term. At the same time, you've got to tackle that confounding challenge of climate change that we occasionally focus on, but it's gone off the radar right at the moment, hasn't it? So we've got lots of, I think, diabolical challenges that we have to confront at the moment. I think it'll take 4 to 5 years for us to work our way through this. If we learn the lessons from this crisis and we invest our way out of this crisis, then we will push the unemployment rate down rapidly, but that will really take a massive, massive appetite from government here in Australia and internationally to do that.
Well, let's see if we're up to it. Gentlemen, thank you both. In concluding today's event, I would like to thank our futurist, Andrew Grill, and Professor John Spoehr from the Australian Industrial Transformation Institute for their insights into this aptly titled Brave Lecture. And I'd also like to thank our audience for the very many illuminating and thoughtful questions that they've put to the panel and that have fostered such a lively discussion here this evening. So you can watch this session again on Flinders' Facebook Live page, revisit it, share it, and we hope that you join us again for our next Brave Lecture. Until that time, please stay safe and take care.